Have you ever witnessed a moment so quiet, so dignified, that it pierced deeper than any scream could? Imagine a man who spent decades serving others, in war zones, hospital rooms, in quiet corners of a library, being shoved to the ground like he meant nothing. No one rushed to help. No one spoke. Just silence. But instead of fury, he offered grace. Instead of revenge, he chose redemption. And in doing so, he reminded a broken young man and all of us watching that real strength doesn't shout, it stands back up. This is the story of Frank Bennett, a man who wore his pain with dignity, and Derek Malone, a man who learned that second chances don't come loud. They come in silence, in service, and in the quiet decision to become someone better. Hurry up, Fossil. You'll croak before you finish your pin. The young man's voice was sharp, mocking. Then came the shove, sudden, forceful. The old veteran staggered forward and slammed into the cold metal of the 8. His glasses clattered to the pavement with a dull crack. A sharp line of blood trickled from his temple. And yet, not a single person moved. No one rushed to help. No one asked if he was okay. The crowd, silent, indifferent, just watched. Phones stayed in pockets. Eyes darted away. It was as if the man had ceased to exist the moment he hit the machine. But the veteran, Frank Bennett, didn't yell. He didn't curse or threaten or plead. He bent down slowly, picked up his card from the ground, then retrieved his broken glasses. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from age. He brushed the dust from his coat, straightened the front of his jacket with quiet, deliberate care, and walked away, head held high, spine straight. He left with every ounce of dignity they had tried and failed to strip from him. And then, 5 minutes later, they came. 3 black SUVs rolled silently into the parking lot, engines low, precise. Doors opened. 6 military police officers stepped out, boots hitting pavement in perfect unison. Not a word was spoken, no confusion, no hesitation. With the kind of focus that only comes from years of discipline, they moved straight past the bystanders, right past the frozen crowd, and directly toward the smirking man still loitering near the ATM, Derek Malone, oblivious to the reckoning, walking straight toward him. Because respect isn't just a word, and what happened next would make that crystal clear. Frank Bennett's mornings had always started early, before the sun stretched over the horizon, before the streets filled with cars and the world began its noise. At 76, his habits were still as sharp and unwavering as the scalpel he once used to stitch open wounds beneath gunfire. He'd been an Army medic, 2 tours, first in Vietnam, then later in Lebanon. But you wouldn't hear that from his own lips. He never bragged, never made a show of his past. Unless you counted the worn olive drab field jacket he wore nearly every day. The cuffs were frayed, the buttons didn't match. But every morning he pressed it by hand with quiet respect. Not for style, for memory. Helen had always liked that jacket. She'd patched it once near the elbow. She'd been his high school sweetheart, long before the draft notices and casualty lists. Frank had returned home when others didn't. And he stayed. With Helen, he built a life grounded in loyalty and quiet love. Their little home sat hidden behind a row of old oak trees, the backyard a bloom of wildflowers she'd planted by hand. Now she was gone. Nearly 10 years. Since then, Frank had lived alone, but not idly. He clung to the rituals that once defined their shared life, as if repetition could preserve her presence. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he volunteered at the VA hospital, not for recognition, but because someone needed to. He held the hands of dying soldiers, whispered comfort, wrote letters for men who couldn't see anymore. Sometimes he simply brought nurses a fresh cup of coffee when they looked too tired to ask. Wednesdays, he walked to the public library and tutored teens in American history. They thought he was just a quiet, retired teacher. They had no idea the stories in the books had once been his. They didn't know what mud smelled like after monsoon rain, or how long a silence lasted when it followed the last heartbeat of a friend. This morning was meant to be different, but only slightly. Today, Frank had promised to take his grandson, Eli, to the small aviation museum just outside of town. The boy had recently become fascinated with jets, maps, and distant places. He'd begun asking questions, the kind no one else ever had. Not out of politeness, out of genuine curiosity, out of love. Frank had never talked much about his time in uniform. Not because he had secrets, but because most people asked with glazed eyes, already halfway somewhere else. Eli asked with his whole heart. He wanted to know his grandfather, not the old man with a garden and a jacket, but the one who had lived through things he couldn't yet imagine. At 9:42 a.m., Frank checked the time. He stepped outside, careful and sure. His hands, calloused and steady, patted his jacket pocket to feel for the folded photograph that never left his side. Helen, in her nurse's uniform, caught mid-laughter just outside the frame. That picture had traveled through decades with him. He drove to the same bank he always used, parked in the exact same spot, gave a familiar nod to the teller behind the window. Routine like clockwork. But something was off. As he approached the outer wall of the bank, he noticed the atmosphere had changed. The parking lot felt louder, harsher. Teenagers in oversized hoodies loitered near the door, voices too loud for the early hour. One man leaned against the brick wall like he owned it, posture dripping with false confidence and forced swagger. Frank didn't pay them any mind. He waited in line, just as he always did, card ready, jacket zipped halfway, wondering whether Eli preferred root beer or cream soda. A small thought, a grandfather's thought. Then came the words, "Move it, fossil. You're holding up the line." He heard them clearly. His face remained calm. No flinch, no anger, no fear. Frank Bennett didn't respond with rage or sharp words. He simply stepped forward and slid his card into the ATM, his movements slow but sure. Because you don't survive 2 wars, a lifetime of loss, and the death of the only woman you ever loved, just to be shaken by a boy whose ego had outgrown his wisdom. What Frank didn't know, what no one around him realized, was that in the next 10 minutes, everything in that parking lot was about to change. Derek Malone stood with his back against the wall, exhaling a thick plume of vape smoke into the morning air as though the world owed him something. He was 31, but the backward cap, oversized hoodie, and exaggerated posture made him look like someone still fighting playground battles long after graduation. Barbed wire tattoos twisted down his arms, grimacing skulls, names etched in thick black ink, the kind meant to look intimidating. But all of it just screamed one thing. Someone desperate to be seen, feared, respected. He had no idea who he'd just shoved, and he certainly didn't see the black SUVs pulling in behind him, but he was about to. Because the measure of a man is not in the noise he makes, but in the silence that follows when justice arrives. Derek stood in line with a scowl carved deep into his face, the kind of bitterness that never quite faded anymore. Life hadn't handed him much, just disappointment stacked on debt and resentment layered over bad luck. Every woman he cared about had either walked out on him or ended up behind bars. He hadn't held a steady job in months. The only reason he was even at the bank that morning was to drain the last sad remains of a check that barely covered 5 days, let alone a week. His car had been repossessed last month. The landlord ghosted him after 2 months of unpaid rent. But in Derek's eyes, none of that was his fault. Not really. The world was broken, and someone else had broken it. Boomers, the system. Men like the one stepping up to the ATM now, that kind of man. Frank Bennett. Just seeing him made Derek's jaw tighten with quiet fury. The guy walked like life owed him no urgency, like the air parted for him just because he was old. That jacket he wore might as well have been pulled from a history museum, probably one of those self-important war vets who expected respect just for surviving something no one asked them to do. In Derek's mind, guys like Frank weren't heroes. They were the architects of a world that left him drowning without a life raft. A world that promised opportunity and handed out closed doors. The line inched forward, then halted. Frank stood at the ATM, slow and deliberate, unfolding his bank card like it was made of parchment. He leaned in to squint at the screen, the lines around his eyes crinkling with effort. Derek exhaled hard through his nose and rolled his eyes. "Come on, Grandpa," he muttered, loud enough for those behind him to hear. No reaction. He stepped closer, louder now, his tone laced with contempt. "What's the holdup, Fossil? You gonna die before you finish your pin?" A few people behind him chuckled uncomfortably. Still, Frank didn't move. didn't glance back. He was locked into the screen, mind focused on numbers, memory, maybe even on someone he was going to see after this. Someone across town, waiting for him in a quiet museum. That indifference, that silence was like gasoline on fire to Derek. He'd grown up in places where silence meant weakness, in homes where shouting meant power, where control was claimed with fists and insults. He didn't understand dignity that didn't demand attention. Frank's calm presence felt like mockery. It rubbed something raw in Derek's bones, something he couldn't name, only react to. He didn't think. He just shoved. Hard. Frank's thin body slammed into the edge of the ATM before collapsing to the ground with a sickening clang, the sound of metal meeting skull, sharp and absolute. His glasses flew off his face, skittered once, then bounced to a halt on the concrete. For a moment, the entire line froze. No one said a word. Then a quiet gasp cut through the stillness. Blood began to trail down from Frank's temple, a thin crimson line carving across aged skin. Derek stood over him, chest heaving, posture tense, half aggression, half panic. The kind of stance men take when they know they have already gone too far, but have no idea how to pull it back. Frank didn't yell, didn't scream, didn't even look at him. Instead, he reached for his glasses, cracked, then his bank card, bent. Using the ATM for balance, he pulled himself upright with slow precision, the steady movements of a man who'd braved worse and refused to show pain. A war medic's muscle memory steadied his frame. His face was unreadable. His shirt, creased from the fall, bore the evidence of blood. Still, he asked no one for help, spoke no curses, just calmly brushed off his jacket as if dusting off 5 decades of noise, and turned toward the parking lot. He didn't limp, didn't rush. He walked with measured steps, steady and proud. Around him, people watched but remained silent. One woman dropped her gaze to her shoes. A young couple turned away, pretending to text, pretending not to see. Derek leaned back against the wall, a scoff on his lips, his jaw twitching. He took a long, angry pull from his vape, trying to mask the tremor rising in his throat. Frank never once looked back. But his steps didn't carry him toward escape. They were taking him somewhere else, something no one expected, especially not Derek, because in the next 5 minutes, everything would change. Across the street, hidden in the shadow of a wide sycamore tree, sat a black SUV with tinted windows, engine idling low, quiet as a breath. Inside, Colonel Isabel Grant sat silently, her eyes fixed on the scene that had just played out. She had seen it all, from the moment Frank Bennett stepped up to the ATM to the brutal way his body hit the metal, to the deliberate, dignified way he stood back up without demanding a thing from anyone. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Colonel Grant had trained herself not to. In her world, hesitation meant missing something vital. And after 25 years in Army intelligence, she didn't miss anything. Every movement, every shift in stance, every threat hiding inside an ordinary moment, she caught them all. And what she'd just witnessed wasn't just a shove. It was a line crossed, a warning flare. Her fingers curled tighter around the steering wheel. Though her uniform was now retired, the instincts were not. And Frank Bennett? He wasn't just another old soldier on a pension. He was the reason she made it home alive after her first deployment. Decades earlier, inside the broken remains of a medical tent near Beirut, she'd been nothing more than a frightened young lieutenant, barely conscious, her head throbbing from a concussion. Half her unit had gone silent over the radio, the rest scattered or bleeding. The chaos outside blurred into the sound of screaming and shelling. And through it all, it had been Frank who'd found her. He was the one who'd stopped the bleeding, who had pulled her out from under the twisted metal and dust, whose calm voice had broken through her panic. With hands steadier than any doctor she'd ever met, he wrapped her shattered arm. They hadn't spoken much in the years that followed, different assignments, different limites, but she'd never forgotten that moment. She'd never forgotten the acrid burn of smoke, the tremble in the air from distant blasts, or the one man who had stayed unshaken while the world tore itself apart. And now that same man had just been shoved like discarded trash, right in front of her, without provocation, without even a word exchanged. Her eyes flicked to the aggressor. He stood there, still at the 18, smirking like nothing had happened, lazily dragging from a vape pen. He had no idea what he'd just done. No clue who it was he had put his hands on. And he certainly didn't see what quiet storm had just been unleashed behind him. Isabel didn't reach for rage. She didn't rise with the kind of fury that clouded judgment. Instead, she reached for training, instinct as natural to her as breath. From the center console of her vehicle, she pulled a sleek black radio, its channel encrypted and reserved for very few. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, steady, almost cold. Code white, Riverside lot, veteran down, respect protocol engaged. 3 seconds of static followed. Then a soft, double-click acknowledgement, clear and immediate. Isabel leaned back into her seat. Her pulse didn't spike, but her jaw had set like steel. She watched as Frank began to approach, slow and upright, one hand pressed gently to his bloody temple. His steps remained measured, dignified, even as his body betrayed signs of the hit. He hadn't noticed her yet. When he reached the curb, she silently opened the passenger door. Without a word, Frank climbed in, moving carefully. His exhale was slow, heavy, but quiet. "Not the first shove I've taken in my life," he said, managing a trace of dry humor. "I've hit windshields harder. But that one, there was no reason behind it. No anger. Just cruelty." She didn't answer right away. She only watched him, watched the blood seeping along his temple, the stubborn way he kept his posture upright, the silent grit in his expression. Finally, she spoke, low but certain. "I don't normally escalate civilian altercations, Mr. Bennett, but this won't be ignored." Outside, the man at the ATM was still smirking at something on his phone, still vaping, still unaware. But already things were moving. Derek Malone hadn't lost his grin. He leaned back casually against the wall beside the ATM, puffing smoke and scrolling through his phone. A video was playing. One of his friends laughed as Derek reenacted the moment, arms flailing, voice animated. "Swear to God, man, he bounced right off the machine. I barely touched the guy, dropped like a bobblehead." He laughed again, proud, loud. At first he didn't hear it, the low hum, a kind of murmuring thunder that crept up from nowhere. Then came the unmistakable precision, the synchronized click of engines. Tires met asphalt with silent intention. 3 black SUVs, identical, glided across the lot in a silent V formation. No flashing lights, no sirens, just presence, intent, authority. The smirk slipped from Derek's face. "What the?" he mumbled. Each vehicle stopped with military precision, sealing the entrance and cutting off the only exit. Doors opened in unison. From each emerged 2 uniformed military police officers. 6 total. Their movements were fluid, disciplined, rehearsed. Olive drab tactical gear. Crisp lines. Sidearms holstered. Body cameras blinking silently beneath the morning sun. They didn't shout, didn't ask questions. No bark commands or warnings. They moved with quiet purpose, scanning the area, assessing, then advancing, not toward the crowd, not toward the vehicles, but toward one man. The man with the vape. Derek's phone dipped lower in his hand. "Hold up," he said into it, his voice catching. "Something's..." Just 20 feet away, Frank sat in the front passenger seat of Colonel Isabel Grant's SUV. A medic approached without fanfare. No ambulance, no chaos, just calm, practiced care. "Sir, may I check that cut?" the medic asked, voice gentle. Frank nodded once, eyes still down, his body still. As the medic lifted a gauze pad to the wound, dabbing with quiet efficiency, there was no pain in his face, only the slow return of dignity. In those small, respectful actions, something unseen was repaired. Back at the ATM, Derek's hands lifted in a hasty surrender, palms open, breath unsteady. "Yo, I didn't do anything, okay? It was just some cranky old dude. He tripped or something, I swear." The lead MP halted 3 feet from him, gaze steady. His voice was low but unwavering. "Step away from the machine, sir." "What for?" Derek's voice cracked, eyes darting left and right. "I didn't even..." "We have a full surveillance," the officer said flatly. "Audio, video, including body-worn footage." Whatever came next, Derek wouldn't be smirking through it. Frank's voice, though calm, carried the weight of years, of battles fought both abroad and within. "You think I wore this jacket for pride?" he repeated, eyes locked with Derek's. "It's not about showing off medals. It's about honoring memory." His fingers brushed the edge of the fabric near his chest, almost absent-mindedly, as though the names and faces it represented lived just beneath the threads. "Men died in this. Some of them were younger than you. Kids, really. They didn't get the chance to come home. Didn't get the chance to screw up, to find their footing again, to figure out who they were outside of the uniform." He took one small step closer, not threatening, just steady, present. "But you got that chance, and you're wasting it." His voice didn't rise, didn't carry blame, just truth. "You're walking around angry at the world because something's broken inside you, and you think if you're loud enough or aggressive enough, no one will notice. But I see it, son. I see it as clear as day." Derek sat there, eyes wide, breath caught halfway in his throat. His posture had collapsed in on itself. All that earlier bravado shrunk beneath the gaze of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to teach. Frank tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Not in judgment, but in quiet recognition. "I've seen tougher men than you lose everything. Not because they were weak, but because they didn't know how to heal. They didn't know how to let go of the noise and sit with the silence long enough to hear what really mattered." When behind them the crowd remained hushed, the gravity of the moment pulling the air taut. Phones were still raised, but now with reverence, not curiosity. A few of the bank employees had stepped out through the glass doors, not to interfere, just to witness. Frank glanced at the MPs, then back at Derek. "You don't need another enemy. What you need is to find yourself before that hole inside you pulls everything else down with it." Derek's eyes stung. He looked down at his hands, fists now open in his lap, fingers trembling slightly. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank didn't nod, didn't smile. "Most don't," he said, "not until it's too late." Colonel Grant still stood by the vehicle, arms folded, eyes steady. She didn't interfere. She knew the power of a man like Frank speaking on his own terms. One of the MPs cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Bennett?" he asked again, soft and respectful. "Do you wish to press charges?" Frank turned slowly to look at him, then back to Derek. For a moment, the air held still. "No," Frank said after a beat. "Not today." The MP gave a small nod and backed away without question. It wasn't mercy, it was wisdom. Frank knew when punishment taught a lesson, and when it simply added to the pile, already crushing a man's spirit. Frank turned to walk back toward the SUV, limping slightly, each step deliberate. Colonel Grant opened the door for him without a word. As he climbed inside, the last of the onlookers slowly began to disperse, their phones lowering, their eyes lingering on the man who had said so much by simply refusing to shout. Inside the vehicle, Frank sat quietly, staring out the window, not at the crowd but at the young man still seated on the curb. Derek hadn't moved. His shoulders were still hunched, but his eyes were finally open. And sometimes that was the first step. Frank had seen the damage cruelty could do when it etched itself deep into a man's soul, hollowing him out from the inside. But he'd also witnessed the quiet miracle of grace, the way it could take root and slowly undo the rot, if someone dared to break the cycle. As he looked at Derek, slouched in shame with his eyes fixed on the pavement, Frank's expression didn't carry anger. It carried understanding, hard-earned and deliberate. Frank turned his head, catching the eyes of the military police officers waiting nearby. He gave them a small, deliberate nod. "I won't press charges." A beat passed. The air stilled. Derek inhaled sharply, as if he hadn't expected mercy. One of the MPs stepped forward, brows knit in confusion. "Sir, are you sure?" Frank turned to him, voice calm but resolute. "Yeah, I'm sure. Let the system flag him. Let the record speak for itself. But I'm not throwing a broken man deeper into a hole he might never climb out of. That's not justice." Colonel Grant stepped closer now, her posture formal, hands clasped behind her back. But when she looked at Frank, something softened in her eyes. "You never did believe in punishment just for the sake of it." she said gently. Frank gave a tired, faint smile, like a man who'd carried too many burdens for too long. We don't always get to choose the wounds we carry, Colonel, but we can choose who we become afterward. Then he turned to Derek one last time, eyes clear and steady. If you ever want something different, something that means something, come find me. I'll teach you how to serve without hurting people. Derek didn't have any words. His throat worked, but nothing came out. He just gave a small, stunned nod, the kind that said everything he couldn't. And then Frank walked away. No crowd, no applause. Just a man with a bandaged head in a past most people would never understand, disappearing into the quiet like it was just another Tuesday. Because for men like him, this wasn't about pride or revenge. It was about choosing dignity, even when the world forgot what it looked like. By noon the next day, the story had already made the rounds. Not from any official source, not through press conferences or statements. Someone had caught the whole scene on their phone. The quiet arrival of military SUVs with no sirens. The officers stepping out like they weren't here to escalate but to understand. And Frank standing tall after being knocked down, speaking to the young man who'd shoved him. The exact moment when Frank said he wouldn't press charges, that he would offer guidance instead, was clipped, captioned, and posted in a small community Facebook group. It didn't take long. The clip caught fire and spread faster than gossip on a windy day. Veteran knocked down at ape. Military shows up. What happens next will restore your faith. At first, it was neighbors sharing it. Then local veteran groups picked it up. Before long, someone on Reddit filled in the gaps. Frank Bennett, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, years of volunteer work at the VA. Never once mentioned his own service. Never once made it about him. By evening, a military podcast out of San Diego ran a special segment on it. The host, Eli Powers, a retired Marine sergeant with a voice like gravel and wisdom earned in sand and smoke, opened the 10-minute episode with a line that stuck in everyone's mind. What does honor look like in public? Because I think yesterday in a quiet parking lot in Riverside, we saw it. Within 48 hours, the clip had hit national news platforms. Veterans from all corners of the country began leaving comments. That man's moral spine is straighter than surgical steel. I did 2 tours in Fallujah. I'd follow Frank Bennett into a storm tomorrow if he asked. Real strength doesn't shout. It just shows up. But back in Riverside, the reaction wasn't flashy. It was deeply human. The bakery next to the ATM, the one where the owner had stood frozen behind the glass, watching it all unfold, was the first to do something. On a strip of brown craft paper taped to her door, she wrote in uneven, trembling handwriting, Frank's table, complimentary coffee for all veterans, every day, no exceptions. People noticed. 2 blocks down, the local hardware store followed. The week after, a diner off the highway added something new to the menu, the Bennett breakfast. 2 eggs, toast, and coffee for $1, with military ID. No announcements, no PR campaign, just quiet, steady gratitude. Frank never asked for any of it. In fact, when he first saw the note on the bakery window, he shook his head and tried to turn it down. But the owner, a woman in her 50s with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, looked him in the eye and said, "You didn't just stand up from that pavement. You helped the rest of us stand up too." Frank said nothing, just nodded once, and never brought it up again. Meanwhile, over at the local high school, a civics teacher played the video for her students. After the clip finished, she turned to the class and asked quietly, "What does dignity look like when no one's watching? And what's the difference between punishment and justice?" The classroom discussion about the difference between authority and power had stretched through the entire period, sparking thoughts that would linger far beyond the bell. Somewhere else, a veteran-focused nonprofit, an organization dedicated to helping at-risk young men through therapy and job training, had been following the story quietly unfolding online. They reached out to Colonel Isabel Grant, asking if she could help put them in touch with Frank. Men like Frank, they said, weren't just storytellers. They were the story. Frank hadn't expected any of it. He wasn't on Twitter. He didn't even own a smartphone. But his grandson Eli did. And one quiet evening, as the sky turned soft over the porch, Eli sat beside him with a root beer in hand and showed him the thread that had gone viral. It was his own words that struck Frank the most, not for their reach, but for their honesty. My grandfather didn't throw a punch, didn't raise his voice. He just stood up and reminded a man who he could be. That's the kind of strength that I want to grow into. Frank had smiled at that, not because of the likes or shares or sudden public attention, but because someone had finally said it, out loud, clear. Strength wasn't always about how you reacted. Sometimes it lived in the stillness, in the refusal to strike back. In a world so often fueled by noise, outrage, and the demand for instant judgment, Frank Bennett had offered something far more rare, a moment of grace, a breath of quiet, a lesson that traveled further than he ever imagined. Not because he sought recognition, but because dignity, even whispered, carries its own kind of power, one that echoes. 3 days after the incident, Derek Malone stood across from the bakery, hands buried deep in the frayed pockets of a second-hand hoodie, a small notepad clutched awkwardly under one arm. He hadn't come prepared with a speech. Truth was, he didn't even know what he wanted to say. But one thing had become clear. He couldn't keep walking away from what had happened, not without at least trying to face it. The video had changed everything. Not just the tags and retweets, not just the comments piling up like a digital avalanche, but the way people saw him now. And a woman at the gas station, they had muttered ATM guy as he walked past. A liquor store cashier told him flat out to leave. Even his cousin stopped returning his texts. Shame was part of what brought him back. But it wasn't the only thing. It was that sentence. That one line Frank had said to him like it had been carved into stone. You've got a hole in your life. Don't fill it with cruelty. He hadn't known what to do with it at the time. Still didn't. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Derek wanted to stop being angry. He wanted to stay still long enough to understand what it meant. The bell over the bakery door gave a soft, uncertain chime as he stepped inside. The woman behind the counter looked up, recognition flashing across her face. You, she said, more breath than word. He kept his eyes low. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quietly. Do you know how I can talk to Mr. Bennett? She didn't answer right away. Then slowly she nodded. 15 minutes later, Frank emerged from the side alley, still wearing that weathered field jacket, the sleeves casually rolled up in the morning light. His face was calm, neutral, not surprised to see Derek, but not exactly welcoming either. Derek held up the notepad like it was a white flag. I'm not here to apologize, he said plainly. You already gave me more grace than I deserved. I want to do something useful. Frank didn't answer immediately. He didn't focus on the words. Words were easy. He studied Derek's body language, how his shoulders hung low, how he wasn't performing for show or penance. He looked like a man exhausted by his own excuses. You sure? Frank asked. No, Derek admitted, but I'm here anyway. Frank didn't offer a lecture or a tidy quote. He just gave a small nod down the sidewalk and said, walk with me. They walked mostly in silence. 10 minutes later, they stepped through a side door into the local VA outpatient center. It smelled like coffee, disinfectant, and old battles still quietly being fought. Frank introduced him to Janice, the therapy program coordinator, a sharp-tongued woman with keen eyes and no time for bullshit. This one needs a sense of purpose, Frank said. Janice looked Derek up and down like she'd met his kind 1,000 times. You got hands? Derek nodded. You got time? He nodded again. Good. The therapy wing needs a runner. You'll mop floors, push carts, fetch supplies, sit with patients if they ask for someone to talk to. If you screw up, you are out. Derek didn't flinch. Fair, he replied. That's how it began. No cameras, no headlines, no dramatic second chances, just quiet, invisible work. At first, Derek was just another anonymous helper, pushing wheelchairs and folding laundry. But as the days wore on, he began to listen. The veterans didn't talk about a glory or medals. They talked about Lusmount, about silence. Another kind of strength, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need applause or headlines, the kind that repairs what's broken, not with force, but with patience. Coming home from war, Derek Malone didn't recognize the man in the mirror. Like so many others, he brought back more than just scars. He carried silence, memories he couldn't outrun, and a gnawing sense that something inside him had gone missing. One afternoon, a fellow vet, a man with a prosthetic arm and steady eyes, looked at him and asked, "You ever lose something that made you mad at everyone else?" Derek didn't answer with words at first. His eyes said enough. Clouded and heavy, they searched the floor before he finally admitted, "Yeah, I think I lost myself." The older man simply nodded and gave Derek's shoulder a reassuring pat. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." Time moved on. Weeks bled into months. And Derek kept showing up, every Saturday without fail. Never late, never causing a scene. He didn't speak much, didn't explain himself, but his actions began to speak louder than any words. He stayed after hours to help older veterans make their way to their cars, steadying them when their legs wobbled or guiding them when confusion took over. Sometimes he even helped deliver meals to those in the memory care unit, walking softly, patiently, offering kindness without asking anything in return. He never told anyone who he was, never talked about the viral video, the rage, or the mistakes. But there were those who recognized him anyway, and they didn't stop him. They didn't need to. Frank never brought it up again either. There was no need. But one afternoon, as he passed Derek in a hallway, he said with quiet certainty, "You're earning your way back, one small act at a time." Derek didn't respond, he just nodded, because he understood. Sometimes redemption doesn't shout. It doesn't arrive in a sweeping gesture or grand moment. It comes quietly in the time we give, the service we offer, and the stillness where anger slowly learns how to listen. It was a brisk Wednesday morning when Frank Bennett returned to the Riverside Bank. Same sidewalk, same parking lot, same ATM humming faintly in the background. An ordinary machine oblivious to the memory it carried. But this time, Frank wasn't alone. Beside him stood Derek Malone, clean-cut, sleeves buttoned, standing calm and steady. Between them was an elderly man clutching Derek's elbow gently. He wore dark sunglasses, a folded white cane at his side. Mr. Howard Ames, nearly blind, hard of hearing, and famously resistant to help. A Korean War veteran, proud and stubborn. But today he had said yes, yes to letting someone guide him, yes to trusting someone, and that someone was Derek. Frank stood a few steps behind, arms folded, watching quietly as Derek guided Mr. Ames to the 8. Derek didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush or show irritation. He offered clear, calm instructions and a steady hand on Mr. Ames' shoulder when he reached for the wrong button. No sighs, no glances of frustration, just presence, just patience. Frank couldn't ignore the symmetry. Nearly half a year earlier, this was the very place where Derek had shoved a stranger into that same ATM and laughed. Now he was helping steady a fellow veteran's hand. It wasn't lost on Frank. The contrast was clear and profound. Across the street, partially obscured by tinted windows, Colonel Isabel Grant watched from a familiar black SUV, a coffee cup resting in her hand. She hadn't intended to be there officially, but someone at the VA mentioned that Derek would be escorting Mr. Ames today, and curiosity brought her. She didn't step out, didn't interfere. She just watched. She watched Derek adjust Mr. Ames's sleeve, smile at something the older man mumbled, and then briefly glance over his shoulder toward Frank. Frank met his eyes and nodded once. Derek returned the gesture. Nothing more needed to be said. There was no fanfare, no applause, just quiet understanding between two men who had once found themselves on opposite sides of a very dark day and now stood together in shared redemption. Colonel Grant took a sip of her coffee and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not all missions required orders. Some of the most important ones happened in plain clothes, in everyday places through slow, intentional steps forward. Steps like these. Frank turned first, walking toward his truck, hands stuffed into the pockets of that same filled jacket he always wore. Derek waited a little longer, ensuring Mr. Ames was safely seated on a nearby bench before moving. As the two men passed one another, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full, rich with understanding, peace, and the quiet echo of something finally beginning to heal. Some people teach with booming voices. They demand attention, pound tables, and raise their fists. But others teach by simply getting back up, by standing taller, even when they feel small, by choosing grace when it's easier to be bitter, by letting the silence say what words never could. And in doing so, they remind us gently, powerfully, what true strength really looks like. It's a different kind of strength, one that doesn't need noise to validate itself. It doesn't posture, doesn't demand attention, or try to win an argument by force. Instead, it stands back up after being knocked down, holds its head high, and walks away, not in defeat, but with quiet, unshakable dignity. That's the kind of strength Frank embodied. What happened between Frank and Garrick wasn't just a confrontation at an ATM. It was something deeper. A moment that held up a mirror to the quiet friction pulsing between generations in America today. Between those who built the ground we all walk on and those who are still searching for their footing. That single exchange carried the weight of history, of misunderstanding, of resentment, and also of hope. But more than a generational clash, their moment was proof of something powerful, that people can change, that redemption isn't reserved for the movies. That kindness, far from being a sign of weakness, is sometimes the greatest show of strength. And that silence, when grounded in principle and guided by compassion, can shift the trajectory of a life more profoundly than any shouted words ever could. In this fast-paced, often unforgiving world, we've grown used to quick judgment. We confuse respect with entitlement, thinking it's owed simply because of age, title, or a patch sewn onto a jacket. But respect, real respect, is something deeper. It's not just earned. It's also something that must be freely given. Frank never demanded respect that day. He didn't lash out. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, when the easier route might have been pressing charges or returning pain with pain, he chose something much harder: grace. He extended an open hand where most would have raised a fist. And by doing that, he didn't just spare a young man from the consequences of a bad decision. He taught him, and all of us watching, what real leadership looks like. Now the question remains, what would you have done in Frank's place? Would you have called the police, spoken out in anger, or would you have chosen to offer a way forward, one paved with forgiveness and a belief that people can grow? These aren't questions reserved for veterans or for those who've worn a uniform. These are questions for all of us. Every single one of us trying to carry forward the legacy of a country built on sweat, struggle, and sacrifice. A legacy still evolving, still finding its voice. If this story touched something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply feel, consider showing your support. Like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories of resilience, quiet courage, and second chances. The kind of strength that doesn't need an audience to be real. And to our older viewers, especially those who've served, thank you. Your quiet example continues to guide the rest of us. We see you, we remember you, and we honor you, because sometimes the loudest truths come not from shouting, but from simply living them.